The blood was already on the floor before anyone called it a crime. A parking garage. 11:47 p.m. One woman standing alone under a flickering emergency light, her scrubs still damp from 12 hours of other people's crises. She wasn't running, she wasn't hiding, she was just waiting, the most harmless thing a person can do. Then the patrol car rolled in slow, the way predators move when they've already decided. Officer Dale Mercer didn't see a nurse. He saw a target. What he didn't see, what he couldn't see, was the 6 years she spent keeping soldiers alive in places that don't appear on any public map. That mistake would cost him everything. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The Harwick Medical Complex sat on the eastern edge of Calverton, like a building that had never quite decided what it wanted to be. The original structure dated back to the early 70s, squat, brutalist, all function, and no mercy. Over the decades, additions had been bolted onto it like afterthoughts. A cancer wing here, a pediatric annex there, a trauma bay expansion that had been celebrated at a ribbon-cutting ceremony and then quietly understaffed for the next 3 years. By the time you reached the parking garage on the north side, you were in the oldest part of the complex, where the fluorescent lighting buzzed like something dying and the security cameras mounted near the stairwells had been on a maintenance request list since March. It was that kind of place, the kind that worked hard and got forgotten. Nurse specialist Vera Calloway knew the garage the way you know a room you've walked through 1,000 times in the dark. She knew which section of the second level smelled like exhaust, no matter the weather. She knew the elevator took 45 seconds longer than it should. She knew the light above Bay 4 flickered twice before it steadied. Not a malfunction, just age. She stood near that light at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, duffel bag over one shoulder, phone in her hand, watching the rideshare app estimate 9 minutes. She was off the clock. Her shift had run 4 hours over what it was supposed to. A trauma case that cascaded into 2, then 3, then a longer night than anyone had planned. Her feet ached with the specific deep tissue exhaustion that only comes from standing concrete floors for 12+ hours, and her eyes felt like they'd been sandpapered from the inside. 9 minutes. She could survive 9 minutes. She didn't hear the patrol car until its headlights swept across the garage entrance, slow and deliberate, the kind of entrance that announces itself on purpose. Calverton PD Cruiser. Unit markings she didn't bother to read. The car rolled in at maybe 5 miles an hour and parked diagonally across 2 empty spots near the ambulance bay. Not because it needed to, but because it could. Vera didn't move. She had learned a long time ago that stillness reads as innocence to anyone who's actually paying attention, and as guilt only to someone who's already made up their mind. She'd learned that in a different context, in a different country, in a different life. But the principle held. The officer who stepped out was built thick through the shoulders, the kind of frame that suggested he'd been athletic once and had since let it calcify into something harder and less flexible. He was mid-40s, maybe. His uniform was precise, everything tucked, everything creased, the kind of precision that has nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with performance. He wore it like armor. His name tag read Mercer. He looked at the garage. Then he looked at Vera. She watched him process her. Scrubs, duffel, phone out, standing alone, and watched his expression settle into something that was either suspicion or contempt, and she couldn't tell yet which one would be worse. He walked toward her without hurrying. "Late to be hanging around out here," he said. Not a question. "I'm waiting for a ride," Vera said. Her voice was level. She'd learned to keep it that way. "Ride." He repeated the word like it needed examination. "From where?" "Rideshare. 9-minute estimate." Mercer looked at her phone like she might be lying about what was on the screen. "You work here?" "Yes." "Doing what?" "Trauma nursing." He made a small sound, not quite dismissive, not quite a laugh. Something in between. "You got ID on you?" Vera kept her expression neutral. "My hospital badge is right here." She indicated the lanyard still around her neck. Harwick Medical, her photo, her department, her name. Mercer glanced at it, then away. I mean government issued. There it was. She reached into her duffel without rushing, pulled out her wallet, and handed him her driver's license. He took it the way people take things from others when they want to make clear that the taking is a demonstration of power, not a practical necessity. He held it a beat longer than he needed to, looked at it, then at her, then at it again. Calloway, he said. That's correct. You live on Pershing Street? Yes. Long way from here. I work here, she said. People generally live somewhere other than where they work. Something in his face shifted. Just slightly. She'd said it flat, no edge in her voice, but it was factually self-evident, and he knew it, and he didn't like that she'd said it. You want to lose the attitude? He said. I don't have an attitude, officer. I'm answering your questions. You're being smart about it. Vera looked at him for a moment. In a different life, in a different situation, she might have said something more. She had the vocabulary for it. Clinical, precise, the kind of sentences that land without raising a voice. But she also understood what this was, and she understood that the situation had its own logic now, and that the logic didn't favor her. I'm sorry if I seemed that way, she said. She wasn't, but the words were practical. Mercer handed her license back and crossed his arms. He looked around the garage slowly, deliberately, as if there might be something she was hiding in one of the empty parking spaces. A woman in scrubs, waiting for a car, at a hospital where she worked. He was performing a threat assessment on a situation that had no threat in it. You shouldn't be out here alone this late, he said finally. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you shouldn't be out here. Vera said nothing. There have been incidents in this garage, he continued. People hanging around who aren't supposed to be. I'm supposed to be here, I work here. I just showed you, but I decide what looks like it belongs and what doesn't. His voice dropped half a register, the way a voice does when someone wants to make sure you understand something isn't a conversation anymore. And right now, what I'm seeing doesn't add up. Vera looked at him. She kept her breathing even and her hands visible, both of them trained habits, not conscious choices. What specifically doesn't add up, she asked. The question seemed to bother him more than anything she'd said yet. Not because it was aggressive, because it wasn't. Go. Inside Harwick Medical, 2 floors up, things were moving in a direction nobody had anticipated at the start of the night. Room 214B had been quietly flagged as a restricted access case since 6 p.m., which at a hospital like Harwick meant something unusual was happening and the administration preferred not to talk about it. The patient, listed in the system under a privacy protocol that the floor nurses had learned not to ask about, had been stable for most of the evening. The attending physician on record was Dr. Emmett Price, a vascular surgeon who also held a federal credentialing that appeared nowhere in his hospital biography. At 11:43 p.m., the patient's vitals had shifted. By 11:51, it had moved beyond a shift into something that required more hands, faster decisions, and the particular kind of controlled chaos that good trauma teams manufacture under pressure. The charge nurse on the floor had immediately pulled in reinforcements from the wing below, which was standard protocol for a case of this severity. What was less standard was the call that went out simultaneously to a number that wasn't listed on any hospital directory. Down in the garage, Vera didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that Mercer had been standing in front of her for nearly 8 minutes now, had run her license through his radio without cause, and was in the process of deciding what move to make next. She could see it in the way he was standing, weight shifting, jaw working slightly, the look of a man recalibrating rather than concluding. You got anything in that bag? He said. Personal items, change of clothes, food containers. Open it. Vera stared at him. You don't have grounds. I'm asking you to open the bag. He said it like politeness was a thin costume he was already tired of wearing. On what grounds? On the grounds that I'm talking to you right now. That's not a legal basis for a search. His expression changed. In the space of 2 seconds, what had been calculation became something colder. You want to go this route? I want to know my rights. That's not a route, that's a question. Mercer uncrossed his arms. He stepped closer. Not enough that anyone watching the camera would call it a threat. Just enough that the geometry of the space changed. She could smell his aftershave, something heavy and industrial. "What I'm hearing," he said quietly, "is that you're making this harder than it needs to be." Vera's jaw was tight. She kept it that way, kept everything controlled, the way she'd been trained, the way it was necessary. Not because she was afraid, because she knew that fear was what he was fishing for, and she had learned in places that would rearrange his understanding of the word difficult. That the most powerful thing you can do in a coercive situation is refuse to give someone the emotional reaction they're hunting. "I'm not making anything hard," she said. "I'm waiting for my ride." Mercer reached out and grabbed her duffel strap. She didn't pull back. That was important. She didn't resist, didn't jerk away, didn't escalate. She simply stood still while he yanked the bag off her shoulder with enough force to twist her arm behind her before the strap went slack. "Hey!" She turned. He shoved her. One hand, flat against her shoulder, hard enough that her back hit the concrete wall of the ambulance bay, with a sound that echoed through the garage. Her shoulder took most of it, and she felt the specific electric sting of concrete edge catching the shoulder blade at the wrong angle. She got her hands up against the wall just fast enough to keep her head from going back. For a moment, neither of them moved. Vera's breathing had changed, not from panic, but from the physiological response to sudden physical impact, the one the body triggers whether you want it to or not. Her heart rate spiked, her vision narrowed at the edges. She brought it back deliberately, the way you bring a patient back, steadily, with intention. "You're going to want to step back," she said. Her voice was quieter than before. Not shaking. Quieter. "You're going to want to comply," Mercer said. His voice had taken on a texture she recognized. Not quite rage, but the cousin of it. The place some people go when they realize they're losing control of a situation they thought they owned. He grabbed her wrist and wrenched it behind her back. The cuffs went on fast and practiced, the way he'd done it 10,000 times. Too tight. Not a mistake. A message. She felt the metal edge dig into the skin of her wrist and said nothing. She straightened, turned her head to the side, and focused on keeping her breathing clean. "You are being detained," Mercer said, his mouth close enough to her ear that she could feel the warmth of it, "for obstructing a lawful investigation and failing to cooperate with—" "There's no lawful investigation," she said. "You have no probable cause. What you have is an employee of this hospital standing in a hospital parking structure with a valid credential around her neck." He spun her around to face him. His expression had cleared into something that wasn't anger anymore. It was worse than that. It was certainty. The comfortable, dangerous certainty of a man who had never once faced a real consequence for doing exactly this. "You think you're smart," he said. "I think I know what I'm entitled to. That's different." He hit her. Not a full swing, more of a slap that carried too much weight behind it, the back of his hand catching her across the left cheekbone. Her head snapped to the side and she tasted copper at the edge of her tongue where the inside of her cheek had caught her teeth. The fluorescent light above Bay 4 flickered twice, then held. Vera straightened slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She turned back to face him with her wrists still locked behind her, blood starting to well in the corner of her mouth. And she looked at him the way she had once looked at situations that were genuinely, irrevocably bad. Not with fear, but with the flat, calm assessment of someone who is already calculating what comes next. Mercer seemed to expect something from her, some kind of collapse or fury or pleading. Something that would confirm the version of this situation he'd decided on. She gave him none of it. "This is going to be a problem for you," she said quietly. It was the calmness that finally cracked something in his face. Not the words. The calmness. Before he could respond, before either of them could move to whatever came next, the sound arrived. It started as a distant wail, and Vera's head lifted automatically, the way it does when you've spent years learning that specific frequency. Emergency alarm. But not patient distress. The sequence was wrong for that. Too sustained, too overlapping, the pattern that hospitals use when the situation moves beyond a single room and starts eating hallways. Through the garage's interior entrance, she could see the stairwell door standing open and a pair of orderlies moving fast in the wrong direction. Not toward something, away from it. A nurse in maroon scrubs sprinted past the door without looking in. A voice crackled over the intercom, clipped and tight. All available clinical personnel, level 2, wing restricted area, immediate response requested. Mercer turned toward the sound. His grip on her arm didn't loosen. Vera knew that alarm. She had been expecting nothing. She had been standing here waiting for a car. 9 minutes. Just 9 minutes. But she knew that alarm, and something in her chest clicked into a recognition that she hadn't expected to need tonight. Level 2. Wing restricted. The only restricted wing on Level 2 at Harwick Medical was 214. She knew who was in 214. She couldn't say how she knew. It wasn't something she'd been briefed on tonight. Wasn't something on a clipboard or a shift assignment. It was the specific kind of knowledge that travels in channels most people don't have access to, the kind built from years of being in rooms that aren't on the map. But she knew. And if she was right, then the alarm going off right now meant the situation in that room had moved past what the available personnel could handle. She turned back to Mercer, who was looking at the hospital entrance with the expression of a man deciding whether this was his problem. "You need to let me go," Vera said. Her voice had changed. Not softer, sharper. The specific frequency of someone who has stepped outside of the situation they were in and into a different one entirely, one where the previous argument was irrelevant. "I'm not letting you go anywhere," Mercer said, without looking at her. He was still watching the stairwell door. "That alarm is a level 2 restricted response. I have clinical credentials for that wing." This was only partially accurate, but it was accurate enough for the moment. The staff inside may not have the specialization for what's happening in there right now. He finally looked at her. "You're under detention." "Then you're making a decision," she said. "Make sure you understand what you're deciding." He stared at her. She held his stare without blinking. Not as a challenge, just as information. Let him see that she wasn't afraid of him. Let him see that the thing he'd just done, the shove, the cuffs, the hit, had not produced the outcome he was accustomed to. She was standing upright, blood on her lip, and she was present, fully and completely, in a way that had nothing to do with this parking garage or his authority in it. The intercom crackled again. "Requesting specialized trauma support, level 2 restricted, all on call, notify immediately." Something moved across Mercer's face that she couldn't fully read. Confusion, maybe. Or the first small seed of something he wasn't ready to name yet. He didn't take the cuffs off, but he didn't push her back against the wall either. Above them, in a room 2 floors up that was surrounded by personnel who had no idea what they were dealing with, a situation was accelerating beyond the edges of their training, toward a threshold that most of the people in that room had never crossed and hoped they never would. And somewhere outside the hospital, on a road that didn't show up in any GPS roading system for civilian use, a convoy had just turned toward Calverton, moving fast. No lights, no sirens. The kind of movement that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. Vera stood in the garage with her wrists locked behind her, and she felt it before she heard it. The low, subsonic presence of heavy vehicles moving in formation. The specific vibration of military transport in a hurry. She had felt it 100 times before. She knew exactly what it meant. Mercer still had hold of her arm. He had no idea that the city had just changed around him. The vibration reached the concrete before the sound did. Vera felt it through the soles of her shoes first. A low, bone-deep frequency that had nothing to do with the hospital's ventilation system or the distant traffic on Caldwell Avenue. She knew that frequency the way you know a voice you haven't heard in years, instantly, in the body, before the mind catches up. Heavy vehicles. Multiple. Moving in coordinated formation at a speed that civilian transport doesn't use in urban environments. Mercer felt it too, though he didn't know what he was feeling. He looked down at the floor for a half-second, instinctively, the way people do when the ground does something unexpected. Then he looked at the garage entrance. Nothing yet. Just the empty mouth of the ramp and the orange wash of the city beyond it. He tightened his grip on Vera's arm. "What is that?" he said. He wasn't really asking her. He was thinking out loud, which meant the confidence was starting to crack somewhere underneath the performance of it. Vera said nothing. She was listening, not just to the vibration, but to the whole acoustic picture of the moment. The alarm on level 2 had shifted tone, which meant either the situation had stabilized or it had gotten bad enough that they'd stopped broadcasting it. The stairwell door was still propped open. She could hear movement through it, the particular shuffle and urgency of medical staff operating at the edge of their capacity. Someone shouted a number. A blood pressure reading, she thought, though the distance warped it. The vibration intensified. Then the lights. They came first as a pale glow at the top of the parking ramp, not blue and red, not the rotating theater of police response. These were white, bright and flat and moving fast, the kind of forward-mounted lights that cut road rather than announce arrival. 2 sets, then a third, then a fourth, materializing out of the ramp's darkness like something the night had been hiding. Mercer actually stepped back. He let go of Vera's arm. The first vehicle cleared the ramp and rolled into the garage with the unhurried authority of something that has never once needed to hurry to be taken seriously. It was a dark tactical transport, not military green, not police black, but a matte charcoal that absorbed light rather than reflected it. No unit markings on the side. Government plates, but the kind that are designed to tell you absolutely nothing. It parked 20 feet from where they were standing, and the engine cut. And for 2 full seconds there was a silence so complete that the fluorescent buzz above Bay 4 sounded obscenely loud. Then the second transport pulled in behind the first. Then the third. 3 vehicles. She counted the doors opening. 8 personnel at minimum. Tactical gear, but not SWAT configuration. Different. The equipment was different. The way they moved was different. The way they oriented to their environment when they stepped out was different. They didn't fan out the way law enforcement does. They moved with specific purpose toward a specific destination, and that destination was the hospital entrance, not the garage itself. Except for one of them. He was the one who had come out of the front passenger door of the lead vehicle, which told her his rank without requiring her to read it. Medium height, late 40s, a face that had been weathered by outdoor environments rather than office ones. He wore no visible insignia, which in certain contexts means more insignia than any uniform can carry. He walked with the kind of deliberate, measured pace that has nothing to prove to anyone in the vicinity. He scanned the garage with the practiced efficiency of a man who assesses environments the way other people breathe, automatically, constantly, without effort. His eyes found Vera. He stopped. Not the stop of surprise. The stop of a man who has located something he was already looking for and is now confirming that what he sees matches what he expected. His gaze moved to her wrist, cuffed behind her back, to the blood at the corner of her mouth. Then up to Mercer, who was still standing beside her with the expression of someone who has just realized they may have walked into the wrong building. The man from the vehicle walked toward them. Not fast, not slow. The exact pace of someone who doesn't need to run because the situation will wait for them regardless. "Lieutenant Calloway," he said. It wasn't a question. Vera felt something in her chest release. Not relief exactly, more like the specific relaxation of a held breath that has been held so long you stop noticing the tension. She looked at him steadily. "Colonel Nast." He looked at her wrists again, then at Mercer. "Officer." Mercer had gone very still. His jaw was working slightly, the internal machinery of a man running through his options at speed and finding most of them closed. "This woman was what?" Nast said. His voice was pleasant. That was the thing about it. It was genuinely, conversationally pleasant, which was somehow more unsettling than any display of anger would have been. She was acting suspicious. She refused to cooperate with a lawful. She was standing in a hospital parking structure wearing a hospital credential. Nast tilted his head slightly. "At a hospital where she's employed." Mercer's mouth opened, then closed. "Take the cuffs off," Nast said. "Sir, I don't know who you—" "I'm not going to say it again." There was no threat in his voice, none at all. That was the point. The absence of threat in a situation where threat was entirely available to him created a kind of pressure that outweighed anything louder. Mercer looked at Nast, then at the 3 vehicles, then at the 7 other personnel who had not stopped moving toward the hospital entrance, but had, each of them, turned their heads slightly in the direction of this conversation. Not aggressively, just aware. Mercer reached for his keys. The cuffs came off. Vera brought her hands forward and pressed her right thumb into the groove the metal had left in her left wrist, deep enough that it would bruise by morning. She rolled her shoulder once, the one that had taken the wall. and kept her face neutral when it pulled wrong. Nast watched this without comment, but he watched it completely. "Are you okay to work?" he asked her. "Yes." "Level 2 has been active for 6 minutes. They need you inside." Vera picked up her duffel from where Mercer had dropped it and slung it over her uninjured shoulder. She started toward the hospital entrance. "Lieutenant," she turned. Nast was looking at Mercer, but he spoke to her. "Does this officer's supervisor work nights?" "I don't know," she said. "We'll find out." He said it the way you say the weather's been mild lately. As simple observation, no particular weight to it. Vera walked through the garage door and into the stairwell and let the heavy metal door fall shut behind her. Level 2 was controlled chaos, which was different from actual chaos in the way that a controlled burn is different from a wildfire. The people moving through the corridor were moving fast, but they were moving right. Each of them oriented toward the same point, making decisions in real time that cascaded into each other with the rough, imperfect logic of a team that has been pushed to the edge of its training and is holding on by competence and adrenaline. The charge nurse, a heavy-set man named Darby, who Vera had worked with for 2 years, caught sight of her coming out of the stairwell, and his face did something complicated, relief and alarm at the same time, which is a very specific expression that only happens in emergency medicine. "Calloway, what the hell happened to your—" "Later," Vera said. "What's the status?" Darby fell into step beside her. "Patient in 214 started tanking around 45 minutes ago. BP dropped. Rate went irregular. Price thinks there's a secondary bleed somewhere they missed in the initial imaging. They've been trying to stabilize for intervention, but—" He lowered his voice. "Vera, the attending brought in 2 residents who've never seen anything close to this presentation. Price is good, but he can't be everywhere." "What's in the room right now?" "Price, 2 residents, 1 OR nurse, and Mallory from cardio who got pulled in because she was still in the building." "Mallory's good." "Mallory's great, but she's been on since 6 this morning, and she's running on coffee." They reached the restricted wing. The door had a keypad and a secondary badge reader, both active. Darby swiped his card, punched the code. She noted that the code had changed since she'd last been through this door, which told her the security protocols around this case had escalated at some point during the day. Room 214B was at the end of a short hallway, set back from the main corridor, with a small anteroom where personnel suited up before entering. Through the window in the anteroom door, Vera could see the controlled frenzy of the room beyond. The patient on the bed, the monitors screaming data in 3 different colors, Price standing at the head of the bed with an expression of focused frustration. The 2 residents moving with the slightly too deliberate care of people trying not to let their uncertainty show. Vera suited up fast. Gloves, gown, the secondary eye protection that the protocol for this case required for reasons that were not explained in the posted guidelines. She pushed through the door. Price looked up. A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise. Then calculation. Then the specific kind of gratitude that surgeons never say out loud but sometimes wear openly when they think the situation allows it. "Calloway," he said, "you're off shift." "I'm here," she said. "Brief me." He did. Fast, clinical, without preamble. The language of people who have worked in conditions where every second of explanation is a second borrowed against an outcome. The patient had presented with a vascular injury pattern that was consistent with a specific type of trauma that Price had only read about in case literature. The initial intervention had addressed the primary bleed, but something in the secondary vasculature was behaving in a way that didn't follow the standard response model. The imaging they had was 6 hours old. The new symptoms suggested a progression that the imaging hadn't captured. Vera listened. She moved to the bedside and looked at the patient. A man in his early 60s, sedated, his face carrying the particular gray-yellow pallor that comes when the body is directing all available resources away from the surface and toward something interior and failing. The monitors told a story that matched what Price had described. She ran her eyes over the chart, the current med schedule, the trending vitals. She'd seen this pattern before, not in a hospital, somewhere else, in a context that bore no resemblance to this room, under conditions that she didn't think about in ordinary hours because there was nothing useful to be gained from it. But the physiological signature was the same. She had learned to recognize it in an environment where not recognizing it meant someone died, and so the recognition had embedded itself somewhere below conscious thought, in the part of clinical knowledge that lives in the hands and the gut, rather than in the retrievable memory. He needs different imaging first, she said. The standard abdominal sequence isn't going to show what you're looking for. You want the vascular protocol, extended. Price looked at her. That's a 30-minute delay. If you go in blind, you're guessing. I've seen this pattern before. She held his gaze. Trust me or don't. But if I'm right about the location of the secondary, going in without the right image is going to make it worse. Price was quiet for 2 seconds. That was his tell. 2 seconds of silence meant he was actually weighing what you said rather than waiting to respond. Okay, he said. Extended vascular protocol. Let's move. The next 32 minutes were the kind of minutes that compress and expand simultaneously, each individual decision feeling instantaneous, the accumulation of them feeling endless. Vera worked alongside Mallory and one of the residents, a young woman named Tran who was shaking slightly but making no errors, which is actually the ideal state for a resident in a situation like this. The shaking means you understand the stakes. The accuracy means you're not letting the shaking win. The imaging confirmed what Vera had identified. The secondary site was in a location that the initial assessment hadn't prioritized. Accessible, but requiring a specific approach that wasn't in the standard protocol for this type of case. Price looked at the image, then at Vera. You've done this approach before. I've assisted it. In what context? She met his eyes. A context where the option was this or nothing. He understood, or understood enough. He wasn't going to ask for more detail than that, and she wasn't going to provide it. The intervention took 47 minutes. It was messy in the way that real medicine is messy. Not the clean, efficient procedure of television, but the iterative, problem-solving, occasionally frustrated work of people pushing at the edge of what they know in real time. Vera called 3 adjustments during the process. 2 of them Price accepted immediately. The third he pushed back on. They argued about it in clipped half sentences while both continuing to work, and then the monitor shifted in a direction that proved her right, which she did not acknowledge out loud because there was no time for that and no point to it. The patient's vitals stabilized at 1:34 a.m. Not fully, not perfectly. He wasn't out of the woods by any measure that mattered, but the acute deterioration had been arrested, and the numbers were moving in the direction that meant they had bought time. For more imaging, for the next decision, for morning when more resources would be available. Price leaned against the wall outside the room and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for the better part of an hour. He looked at Vera. That imaging call, he said. That was the difference. Maybe. Not maybe. She pulled off her gloves and dropped them in the disposal bin and said nothing. Your mouth, he said. He was looking at the dried blood at the corner of her lip with the expression of a physician who has just cycled down from a crisis and is now noticing things he was too focused to process before. What happened? Parking garage. He stared at her. Someone. It's being addressed, she said. Vera. It's being addressed, she said again, and the way she said it closed that door. Price looked at her for a long moment. He had known her for 2 years, had worked beside her in high-pressure situations enough times to have a calibrated sense of her, the way colleagues who've been through difficult things together develop a specific kind of shorthand. He knew that its being addressed from Vera Calloway was not deflection, it was information. He nodded once and let it go. Downstairs in the parking garage, it was a different kind of work happening. Mercer had not left. This was either stubbornness or stupidity, and from the outside it was hard to tell the difference. He had retreated to his patrol car after NAS's personnel had moved into the hospital, and he'd sat there with the engine off and the door closed, which was technically within his rights as a law enforcement officer who had not been ordered off the premises. Technically. NAS knew he was there. One of his team had noted it within the first 5 minutes. Noted it and noted it to NAST without being asked, because that's what trained personnel do. NAST was in the anteroom adjacent to Level 2's restricted wing, coordinating with 2 of his team members in a conversation that took place at low volume in covered ground that would not have meant much to most of the people walking past in the corridor outside. He was also, simultaneously, on a call, earpiece, one-sided from the outside, the kind of call where he mostly listened and spoke in short confirmations. When the call ended, he stood still for a moment with the particular stillness of a man integrating information before deciding what to do with it. "Run the officer," he said to the woman standing to his left. A compact, dark-haired analyst named Briggs who carried a tablet the way other people carry a coffee cup. "Already pulled his record," Briggs said. She turned the tablet to face him. Dale Mercer, 12-year career with Calverton PD, 7 complaints on file. Excessive force, 4 counts. Intimidation, 2. Unlawful search, 1. 6 of the 7 were dismissed internally. Dismissed or buried? Briggs tilted her head in a way that meant same thing, different paperwork. "Who's his direct supervisor?" "Sergeant Lou Ferrante, Central Division." She swiped. "Ferrante's been with Calverton PD for 19 years. 3 commendations, no complaints." She paused. "The 2 are close. Same church, same bowling league, known to socialize outside work." Nass looked at the tablet for a moment. "Body cam." Mercer's camera was on. "Get the footage." "It may require a formal request through—" "I know what it requires." He said it without impatience. "Start the request. Simultaneously, identify any other cameras in that garage. Hospital security, adjacent structure, anything with a line of sight." Briggs was already moving. Nass turned toward the window at the end of the corridor, which looked out over the north side of the complex. From this angle, he could see the top edge of the parking garage ramp and the faint outline of a patrol car that hadn't moved in 40 minutes. He had been doing this job for a long time. He had, over the course of that time, encountered many varieties of the same basic problem. The person who abuses the authority they have because the people around them have never made the abuse cost anything. The varieties changed. The mechanism didn't. And the mechanism had a consistent weakness, which was that it depended on things staying quiet, on witnesses being unreliable or unavailable, on paperwork moving slowly and organizational loyalty moving faster. Tonight, those conditions didn't apply. He turned away from the window. At 2:10 a.m., a night administrator at Harwick Medical named Gordon C.O. received a call from his department head at home. Unusual, not unheard of, but the specific nature of the call was something Gordon would later describe as unlike anything in 15 years of hospital administration. The department head told him, in precise and unemotional language, that federal personnel were currently operating within the facility, that Gordon was to extend full cooperation to those personnel and their requests, and that he was not to discuss the nature of that cooperation with anyone outside the administrative chain without explicit clearance. Gordon wrote this down. Then he went upstairs and knocked on the door of the restricted wing anteroom and introduced himself to a woman with a tablet who told him, pleasantly but without discussion, what she was going to need from him. The list included security footage, badge access logs, and the contact information for every supervisor in Harwick Medical's security department. Gordon looked at the list, then at the woman. Is this about what happened in the garage?" Briggs looked at him with a patience that was not unkind. "It's about several things that are connected," she said. "We'll explain what we can when we can. Right now, the most helpful thing you can do is get me what's on that list." Gordon got her what was on the list. Vera was sitting in the staff break room on level 1 at 2:27 a.m., her duffel at her feet, a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk going cold on the table in front of her. She was not decompressing. She didn't have the bandwidth for that yet, and honestly, the word had always seemed slightly absurd to her anyway, like treating the body as something that needed to be handled rather than something that would handle itself if you gave it a minute and some quiet. She was just sitting. Her shoulder hurt. Her wrist had bruised in a wide band where the cuff had bitten, and the mark at the corner of her mouth had dried to a rust-colored line that she'd looked at once in the bathroom mirror and then stopped thinking about. The pain was real, and she was aware of it, and she also had the particular relationship with physical discomfort that develops in people who have spent time in environments where pain is contextual, not something to be numbed or transcended, just something that exists alongside everything else and doesn't get the deciding vote. She heard the door. Nast came in carrying 2 cups, one of which he set in front of her without asking, replacing the cold one. He sat across the table. He didn't make the mistake of asking how she was doing, which she appreciated. "The patient is stable," she said. "I know. Price briefed me 10 minutes ago." He turned his cup in his hands. "The approach you recommended." "It worked." He said more than that. Vera looked at the window. The break room looked out onto a small interior courtyard that was just a concrete square with a bench and a dead plant in a pot. Not much to look at, but it was something that wasn't a wall. "I'd seen the presentation before," she said. "Where?" The answer to that question had a location and a set of dates, neither of which she was going to say in a hospital break room. She looked at him and let the silence answer it. Nast nodded. He understood that kind of silence. He'd produced it himself, in other contexts, when other people had asked him similar questions. "The officer is still in the garage," he said. "I know. His body cam footage has been secured. The garage has 3 working cameras. 2 of them had a direct line of sight to Bay 4. Vera said nothing. "His record is not clean," Nast continued. "There are 7 complaints going back 8 years, most of them suppressed through internal review. The pattern is consistent." "It usually is," she said. "There are people who are going to want to talk to you in the morning. Hospital administration, probably a city investigation depending on how fast this moves. You should be prepared for that. I'm not worried about it." "I know you're not." He said it without condescension, just as a statement about something he'd already assessed. "But I wanted to make sure you knew it was coming, so it didn't arrive as a surprise." She nodded. He stood. "You have somewhere to stay tonight. That ride share? I'll arrange something. There's a secure transport available if you want it." Vera looked at him. "I don't need a security detail, Colonel." "I know," he said again. "It was an offer, not an assessment." She almost smiled. Almost. Her face did something in the direction of it before she caught it. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He didn't turn around, just stood with his back to her for a moment, like a man completing a thought before he spoke it. "You did good work tonight," he said. "Both of it." She knew what he meant by both, the room and the garage. The clinical precision and the other thing, the thing you don't have a clinical term for, the way some people absorb a violent situation without letting it reshape them, without becoming smaller or harder or distant in the ways that violence usually carves people if it hits them right. "I was waiting for a ride," she said. He let out a short breath. Not a laugh, but the involuntary precursor to one. "Get some sleep." He left. Vera sat in the break room for another few minutes. Outside the window, the courtyard was very still. A gust of wind crossed it and pushed a dead leaf across the concrete in a small, irregular arc. She reached into her duffel and found her phone. The rideshare app was still open. The canceled request from earlier, the timer frozen at its last estimate. She started a new one, 7 minutes. She was standing in the lobby when the notification came through. Not from the rideshare app, but from an internal hospital communications system, a routing that normally sent shift updates and scheduling changes. The message was brief and came from an address she didn't recognize within the hospital's administrative domain. It read, "Security Review, Incident Bay 4, North Garage. Footage flagged. Formal review initiated 2:34 a.m. Notification sent to Calverton PD Internal Affairs, Harwick Medical Risk Management, City Oversight Office. Officer on scene requested to remain available for questioning." She read it twice. Somewhere in the hospital above her, a patient was alive who might not have been. Somewhere in the parking garage outside, a man who had put his hands on her was sitting in a patrol car watching the same notification arrive on his department-issued phone, and she could not see his face, but she had a reasonable sense of what was on it. She put her phone in her pocket. The lobby doors opened automatically as a gust of outside air pushed through the gap, and for a moment the night was just the night. The city, the dark, the particular silence of a place that has been awake too long and is only now starting to understand what it witnessed. Her ride pulled up to the curb. She stepped outside. The patrol car in the garage hadn't moved. She could see its outline at the top of the ramp, windows up, engine dark, the shape of a man sitting very still in the driver's seat with the quality of stillness that isn't rest. That's the stillness of someone waiting for something to arrive, not knowing exactly what shape it's going to take, not knowing how bad it's going to be, only knowing, finally, irreversibly knowing that it's coming. She got in the car. The driver asked her name. She told him. He pulled into the street and Harwick Medical fell behind her, and she sat with her hands in her lap and the city moving past the window. And she was thinking about the patient upstairs, and about the look on Price's face when the numbers turned, and about the specific sound the cuffs had made when Nast told Mercer to take them off. Not the mechanical click of the release, but the silence right before it, the moment of recognition that the world had reorganized itself around Officer Dale Mercer in a way he had not anticipated and could not reverse. She was not thinking about revenge. She had never been built for revenge. It requires a certain kind of focus on the past that she had, by necessity and by choice, learned to redirect forward. She was thinking that tomorrow was going to be a long day. She was thinking about the look on Tran's face when the vitals turned, the young resident with the shaking hands and the steady accuracy, who had stayed in the room for the whole 47 minutes without making a single error that mattered, and who didn't know yet that she had just passed a threshold that most physicians only cross once in their careers, and that the passing of it changes something permanently. She was thinking about the dead plant in the courtyard, the way the leaf had moved. Her phone lit up on her lap, a number she didn't recognize, area code that placed it outside Calverton. She stared at it for a moment, then let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the voicemail notification appeared. She didn't open it. Then a text, same number, Callaway. Don't ignore this. It's about tomorrow. There's something you need to know before the review starts. She looked at the message. The driver glanced in the mirror. Everything all right? Fine, she said. She looked at the message for another moment, and then she put the phone face down on the seat beside her, and she watched the city go by. And she tried to decide whether fine was actually the right word for any part of tonight. And she was still trying to decide when the car turned onto her street, and she saw, parked directly in front of her building, a vehicle she did not recognize. Dark. Matte finish. No markings. Not one of Nast's. His team drove charcoal transports, not this. This was a different configuration, older body style. The kind of vehicle that belongs to an agency that has been operating long enough that its equipment reflects several different procurement cycles. Someone had been here long enough to park and cut the engine. Long enough to wait. Vera looked at it from the back seat of the rideshare and did not look away. "This your stop?" the driver asked. "Yes," she said. She did not move for 3 full seconds. Then she opened the door. She got out of the car. The night air was cooler than it had been earlier, carrying the particular dampness that settles over Calverton in the hours before dawn when the city's heat finally surrenders to the dark. Vera stood on the sidewalk with her duffel over her shoulder and looked at the vehicle parked in front of her building with the same unhurried assessment she applied to everything that presented itself as a problem. Older body style. Clean, despite the age, someone maintained it. The driver's side window was cracked exactly 2 inches, which meant the person inside had been there long enough to need ventilation. Not Nast's configuration, not Calverton PD, wrong plates, wrong profile, and a cop waiting outside her apartment at 3 in the morning would have identified himself differently, would have called the department first, would have left a paper trail before making the move. This was something else. She walked toward it without hesitating, because hesitation on an empty street at this hour is its own kind of signal, and she had spent enough time in situations with real threat gradients to know that the vehicle in front of her building was not one of them. Whoever was inside had come to talk. People who come to do other things don't park under a functioning streetlight. The window came down the rest of the way as she reached it. The woman behind the wheel was in her mid-50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that has been in enough difficult rooms that it has stopped performing anything for anyone. She wore civilian clothes, good quality, deliberately nondescript. No visible credentials. "Callaway," she said. "You sent the text," Vera said. "Get in." Vera looked at her for a moment, then she opened the passenger door and got in, dropping her duffel at her feet. The interior smelled like black coffee and recycled air. On the back seat, a closed laptop and a manila folder with a red border. "Who are you?" Vera asked. "My name is Sandra Orville. I work with the Office of Federal Accountability, not the public-facing office, the Internal Review Division." "Nast doesn't know you're here." It wasn't a question. Orville's expression confirmed it anyway. "We monitor federal field operations," Orville said, "including Colonel Nast's unit. What happened tonight at Harwick Medical falls under our jurisdiction, but it also overlaps with something we've been watching for considerably longer than one night. She reached to the back seat without looking and brought the manila folder forward. She set it on the center console but didn't open it. Mercer is the small part of this. Vera looked at the folder. How small? Sergeant Ferrante has been running interference for Mercer's complaints for 6 years. In that time, 3 formal investigations were killed before they reached the review board. 2 witnesses withdrew statements under circumstances that don't hold up well to scrutiny. Orville tapped the folder. And Ferrante has a relationship with 2 members of Calverton PD's Internal Affairs Division that isn't documented anywhere, but shows up very clearly when you look at case disposition patterns over the same 6-year window. You're describing a protection network. I'm describing what happens when people with authority decide that accountability is optional, Orville said. Mercer is a symptom. What I need from you is a formal recorded statement that we can use to anchor the wider investigation, because without the primary incident on record, your incident, everything else is circumstantial pattern analysis. Vera was quiet for a moment. Outside the windshield, the street was empty. A traffic light at the corner cycled through green to yellow to red, with no cars to respond to it. You could have called me, Vera said, or reached me through NAST, but NAST's operation has its own oversight concerns that I'm not in a position to discuss with you. And the moment your statement enters his chain of documentation, certain parties within city government get notified through channels that move faster than formal review. Orville met her eyes. I needed to reach you before morning, before the review meeting at 9, specifically. There's a review meeting at 9. Hospital Administration, City Liaison, Calverton PD Command. Ferrante will be there representing Mercer's division. Orville paused. He's been told about the footage, and he spent 2 hours tonight on the phone with the department's legal office. Whatever case they're building for that meeting, they've had a head start. Vera looked at the folder again, the red border, the weight of it. What's actually in there? Orville opened it. The first page was a photograph, a security still from a camera Vera hadn't known was in the garage. High angle, Bay 4, timestamp reading, 23:51:08. The image was sharp enough to be unmistakable. Mercer's hand flat against her shoulder, her back hitting the wall, her hands coming up to catch herself. The next page was a second still, 12 seconds later by the timestamp. Her face turned sideways, his arm raised. The third page was not a photograph. It was a printout of a citizen complaint filed 14 months ago by a woman named Paulette Arroyo, a home health aide who had been stopped by Mercer outside a clinic on the south side of Calverton. The complaint described a pattern almost identical to what had happened in the garage. It had been reviewed by Ferrante's division and marked insufficient evidence, case closed. Vera read the Arroyo complaint in its entirety. It took less than 2 minutes. She withdrew the complaint, Orville said quietly, because someone made her. We believe so. She relocated 6 months later. We've made contact, but she's not ready to go on record. A pause. You are, though. And you have something Paulette Arroyo didn't have. Vera closed the folder. People in the room who can't be intimidated. Federal witnesses, federal documentation, and a body cam recording that Mercer can't explain away. Orville let that sit. But only if the statement is in the right hands before that 9 o'clock meeting. If Ferrante walks into that room with administrative counsel and no formal victim statement on file, the narrative shifts. It becomes a miscommunication, an overreaction to a tense situation. By the end of the meeting, there's a reprimand in Mercer's file, and the whole thing disappears by Friday. Vera understood the mechanics of this. She had seen institutional self-preservation operate in environments far more high stakes than a hospital administrative meeting, and it always looked the same. Not dramatic, not overtly corrupt, just the slow, grinding work of people protecting the structure they lived inside, making small adjustments to reality until the sharp edges were gone. Where do you need me? She said, upset. They worked in the car for 40 minutes. Orville had a recording device, a legal witness form, and a methodology that was clearly practiced. She asked precise questions in a sequence that built an evidentiary timeline, not a narrative, which is what formal review requires. Not how did it feel, but where were you standing? What did he say? What did you say? What was the exact sequence of physical contact? Vera answered in the same register. Clinical, specific, without embellishment or editorializing. The way she had been trained to document in environments where documentation was the difference between accountability and impunity. Her shoulder pulled when she moved her arm to demonstrate the angle of the shove. She noted it and kept going. When they finished, Orville played the recording back. Vera listened to her own voice, flat, precise, unhurried, and thought about how strange it was that the worst moments of a night can be reduced to timestamps and directional descriptions, stripped of the cold concrete and the fluorescent buzz and the specific horror of realizing you are entirely at the mercy of someone who has decided to enjoy that fact. She signed the form. One more thing, Orville said. She reached to the back seat again and produced a second folder, thinner, unlabeled. She handed it to Vera without opening it. This is why Mercer targeted that area of the garage specifically tonight. Not random. Targeted. Vera opened the folder. Inside was a single page, a map of Harwick Medical's parking structure with 3 locations marked in red. Bay 4, where she'd been standing. A secondary entrance on the east side of the garage, and a stairwell access point on the interior north wall. Underneath the map, 3 lines of text. Incident dates, times, locations. All 3 were in the same garage. All 3 were in the last 4 months. None of them had generated a formal complaint. He's been using that garage, Vera said. 3rd time in 4 months we can document. There are likely more. Orville's voice was even. It's a low camera zone. Most of what's mounted in there has been on the maintenance list for months. Someone in hospital security has been slow-walking the repair requests. Vera looked at the map. She felt something cold move through her. Not fear, not anger. The specific chill of understanding a pattern that is larger and older and more deliberate than you initially measured it to be. How many people knew I was going to be in that garage tonight, she said. Orville was quiet for a beat too long. That's a question I'm still working on, she said. Vera looked at her. The restricted case on level 2, the patient, the federal protocol, that information was supposed to be contained within a very small coordination chain. Orville held her gaze. Mercer knew to be at Harwick Medical at 11:30 tonight. He was not assigned to that district. His shift covered the East Corridor, 6 miles from here. He made 2 radio calls before 11 that logged him in his assigned district, and then he went dark for 40 minutes. Vera processed this slowly, deliberately, the way you process something that changes the shape of everything that came before it. Mercer hadn't stumbled into the garage. He'd been there because someone told him to be there. Someone who knew that she would be in that parking structure at that hour, in that bay, waiting for a car that would take 9 minutes. Someone who knew about the federal patient on level 2. You think someone wanted me out of the building, she said. I think, Orville said carefully, that what happened to you tonight may have had less to do with you personally and considerably more to do with what was happening in room 214-B. The interior of the car was very quiet. Vera sat with that. She was tired, genuinely, deeply tired, the kind that has been accumulating for hours and is now pressing on the backs of her eyes and the base of her neck. But the tiredness existed behind a wall of something more alert, more focused, that her body had not yet agreed to lower. Someone had wanted her away from that room, which meant someone had known she would be relevant to what was happening in that room, which meant the information about the patient, about Vera's specific operational background, about her presence at Harwick tonight, that information had traveled somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Price, she said, we don't know yet. He's the attending on record. He's the only one with full access to the case parameters. He's also the one who called you back in after the alarm, Orville said, which doesn't fit the profile of someone trying to keep you out. Unless he didn't make the original call, Vera thought about it. The alarm went out as a general clinical request. Anyone monitoring hospital communications would have seen it. And Price? She stopped. What? Price pushed back on me during the intervention. One of the adjustments I called, he argued it. She frowned. He's never done that before. Was he wrong? No, I was right, and he knew it within about 90 seconds. She paused. But the hesitation was unusual. Price doesn't hesitate on clinical calls. Orville was writing something on a small notepad. We'll look at who had access to the case assignment before tonight. Vera opened the car door. The night air came in, cool and damp. Get some sleep, Orville said. The review meeting is at 9. I'll have your statement in the appropriate hands by 7. Vera stepped out. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at her building. A 4-story brick structure, ordinary, the kind of building that has no opinion about anything that happens inside it. Orville, she said. The woman looked at her through the open door. The patient in 214, is he going to make it? Orville's expression did something brief and complicated. That's above my pay grade. It isn't, Vera said. You know. A pause. The people he's connected to want him alive, which means significant resources will be applied to making sure he is. Another pause. What happened in that room tonight gave him a better chance than he had before you walked in. That's what I know. Vera nodded. She closed the door. The vehicle pulled away from the curb slowly, no headlights, until it reached the corner, and then it turned and was gone. She stood on the empty sidewalk for a moment. Somewhere 2 blocks over, a dog was barking at something, the steady, rhythmic bark of an animal that has noticed a disturbance and is reporting it to no one in particular. Above the buildings to the east, the sky had developed the first faint gray gradient that precedes dawn. Not light yet, just a lesser dark. She went inside. Her apartment was the way she had left it at 6 the previous morning. Dishes in the rack, a book open on the coffee table, her off-duty jacket on the back of the chair by the door. She dropped her duffel and sat on the edge of the couch and held her wrist in her other hand and looked at the bruise, which had darkened in the last hour into something that was going to be very visible and very legible for anyone who looked at it in the daylight. She set an alarm for 6:30. That gave her 3 hours. She lay back on the couch because the bedroom was too far, and she pulled the jacket off the chair over herself, and she was asleep faster than she thought she would be. She dreamed about the patient's vitals turning, the monitor going from the screaming red of deterioration to the amber of stabilization, the specific moment when the numbers stopped moving in the wrong direction and hold and hold and hold. In the dream, the room was wrong. Wrong dimensions, wrong smell, the walls too close, but the monitor was exactly right. The sound of it familiar in the particular way that things you've done under pressure get encoded differently than ordinary memory, cleaner and more complete. She woke to her alarm at 6:30 with her hand already moving to silence it. For a moment she lay still and looked at the ceiling and ran through everything from the night before in the order it had happened, the way she had trained herself to do after difficult operational periods. Not dwelling, just accounting, making sure she had the timeline straight, making sure nothing had slipped through the exhaustion and misremembered itself. The garage. Mercer. The alarm. Level 2. NAST. The intervention. Price. The car. Orville. The map with the 3 red marks. The thing Orville had said. He was not assigned to that district. She sat up. Her phone had 3 missed calls, all from the same number, the same one that had texted her in the rideshare. She hadn't noticed them come in during the 3 hours she'd been asleep. The calls were spaced 20 minutes apart, starting at 4:15 a.m. The last one had come in at 4:55 a.m. Then nothing. She checked the time, 6:31. She pressed play on the voicemail from the first call, the one she'd let go while in the rideshare car before she'd seen Orville's text. A man's voice, low, slightly hoarse, speaking quickly. Calloway, I know you don't know this number. I'm not going to identify myself on a recording. What I need to tell you is that Orville is not. She's not what she... A long pause, the sound of someone choosing words very carefully. The review meeting isn't a review. They're not reviewing Mercer. They're reviewing you. Everything from tonight, the intervention, your access to the restricted wing, your contact with the federal personnel, it's all going to the review board as an unauthorized operational involvement. Someone filed the request at 1:47 this morning. Vera stopped the message. She looked at the time of the voicemail. 4:15 a.m. She had been in the car with Orville until approximately 3:50 a.m. She had given Orville a signed statement at 3:47 a.m. She had handed over her account of everything. The timeline, the clinical intervention, the names. The formal review request against her had been filed at 1:47 a.m. before she'd given the statement. before she'd gotten in Orville's car, which meant either the review request had been filed based on information gathered before Orville had approached her, or Orville had known it was coming. Vera was on her feet, already moving to the bedroom for clean clothes, her mind running the sequence again at speed. The statement she'd signed, the recording, the folder Orville had shown her, says the map with the 3 red marks, the Arroyo complaint, the photographs from the garage camera. Orville had given her information, but she'd also received information. A signed statement, a recorded account, a comprehensive timeline that placed Vera inside the restricted wing, in contact with federal personnel, in a role that no one with authorization had officially sanctioned. The statement Vera had signed was accurate. Everything in it was true. But truth, in the hands of the wrong person, doesn't arrive as truth. It arrives as evidence for whatever case it's needed to support. She pulled on a clean shirt, moved to the bathroom, splashed water on her face, looked at the line of dried blood at her lip, the bruise at her wrist. She picked up her phone and called the number back. It rang 4 times. Then a voice. The same man, more careful now. "You got the message?" "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who's been watching Orville's division for 3 months. She's not internal review. She's damage control." "The difference is..." "Whose damage?" Vera said. Silence. Then, "The patient in 214, he's not just a federal case, he's a witness. Active, scheduled, protected. And there are people, not Mercer, not Ferrante, people considerably further up, who needed him compromised last night, and when that didn't work..." A sound in the background. Movement. The man's breathing changed. "They're going to use the statement you gave her," he said quickly, his voice dropping. "They're going to present it at 9 as evidence that you exceeded your operational role and accessed a restricted federal case without authorization. It reframes the whole night. Mercer becomes incidental. You become the story." "How do I stop it?" Vera said. The line went dead. She stood in her bathroom holding her phone and looking at her own face in the mirror. Bruised lip, dark circles, the particular expression of someone who has been awake for 22 hours and has just understood that the fight she thought was almost over hasn't started yet. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up. She could hear it, traffic starting to move on Caldwell Avenue, a bus somewhere, the sound of a city resuming itself without any awareness of what had moved through it in the night. The review meeting was in 2 hours and 18 minutes. And somewhere between this bathroom and that conference room, someone was expecting her to walk in already defeated. She had 2 hours and 17 minutes, and she spent the first 4 of them standing in her kitchen drinking coffee she didn't taste, thinking through the geometry of the problem. The statement she'd given Orville was accurate. That was the fixed point. Everything in it was true and verifiable and consistent with the body cam footage and the garage cameras and the physical evidence on her own body. The problem wasn't the content of the statement. The problem was who held it and what they intended to do with the surrounding architecture. The framing, the sequencing, the carefully selected context that could make an unauthorized federal witness intervention out of a trauma nurse doing her job in a restricted wing she'd been called into by the attending physician on record. She needed Price. She called him at 6:44 a.m. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. "You've heard about the 9 o'clock meeting," she said. A pause. "I got a notification from administration at 6 this morning. I'm on the attendee list." Another pause, longer. "Vera, I got a call last night, around 2, maybe 2:15. A woman from what she described as federal accountability. She asked me questions about the intervention, about your specific role, about whether you had been formally authorized to assist with the restricted case." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were a trauma specialist I had worked with for 2 years and that your clinical judgment last night was the reason the patient is still alive this morning." His voice was tight. "Was that wrong?" "No," she said, "but she's going to characterize it differently." "How?" "That you brought in an outside specialist without authorization, that I accessed restricted federal medical protocols beyond my clearance, that the situation was handled incorrectly and I was part of the problem rather than the solution." Silence on the line. "Price," she said, "when you called me into that room last night, was there any authorization issue from your perspective? Clinically, procedurally?" You're a Harwick employee. The restricted wing has a blanket protocol that any clinical staff member can be admitted under emergency escalation criteria. I invoked that criteria at 11:53. His voice steadied. I have the documentation. Bring it. I will. A beat. Vera, who is this woman? Orville? I don't know yet, she said, but I'm working on it. She ended the call and opened her laptop. Sandra Orville, Office of Federal Accountability, Internal Review Division. It took her 11 minutes to establish that no such internal division existed under that name in the federal directory she had access to. The Office of Federal Accountability had an external review branch and a congressional liaison office and a public compliance department. It did not have an internal review division. It had never had an internal review division. The name was real. Orville appeared in a federal employee registry from 4 years ago, attached to a different department entirely, one that dealt with interagency coordination on sensitive domestic cases. Her last listed position had ended abruptly with no forwarding assignment, the kind of abrupt ending that means either a significant reassignment that doesn't get documented in accessible registries or something messier. Vera looked at the time, 6:59. She called Nast. He answered immediately, which told her he was already awake and already aware that the night had developed complications he hadn't fully accounted for. Orville, she said, a 2-second pause. Where did you hear that name? She was parked outside my apartment at 3 in the morning. I gave her a recorded statement. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she could hear him breathing, the controlled, deliberate breath of someone managing a reaction they don't intend to display. Tell me exactly what she said, he said. She told him. She did it in the same clinical register she'd used with Orville, sequential, precise, without omission. When she finished, Nast was quiet for a moment. She showed you a folder, he said. The map, the Arroyo complaint, the garage photographs. Yes. All of that information is accurate. The map, the complaint, the photographs, those are real. I know. But the statement you signed, it's going to be presented at 9 o'clock as evidence that I operated outside my authorized role in a federal case, Vera said. Someone filed a formal review request against me at 1:47 this morning, before she approached me, before I gave her anything. Another pause. That timing isn't possible unless she already had the framework built. That's what I'm working with, Vera said. Colonel, I need to know who filed the request. I'm already looking. She could hear him moving, doors, the background shift of someone changing locations while staying on the line. Orville doesn't work for the accountability office. She hasn't for 4 years. She was reassigned to a coordination function under the deputy director's office. Sensitive domestic. I can't give you the full designation on an open line. But she has access to federal records. She has access to considerably more than that, Nass said. Which means whoever she's working for tonight has the infrastructure to make this look official. A beat. The patient in 214. This is connected to the patient. Someone wanted him compromised, Vera said. When that didn't work, they needed to discredit the intervention. And you're the intervention, he exhaled. I need you to listen to me carefully. Do not go into that meeting without representation. Is there someone in Harwick's legal structure you trust? The hospital's legal office works for the hospital, not for me. Then we need someone else in that room. He was thinking out loud now, the practiced rapid-fire logic of someone working a problem at operational tempo. I can have someone there by 8:30, someone who understands both the federal angle and the employment side. But you need to stay out of reach until then. Don't make contact with anyone from the administration. Don't respond to any messages from numbers you don't recognize, and do not speak to anyone claiming to represent the accountability office. Already done, she said. What are you going to do for the next 90 minutes? I'm going to find out who made the phone call, she said. The man who'd called her at 4:15 had used a number with a Calverton area code, which was either genuine or chosen to appear so. She'd tried calling back once, gotten nothing. She tried again at 7:15, standing at her kitchen counter with her second cup of coffee and her laptop open to a federal personnel directory that she technically had access to through a credentialing pathway she hadn't used in over a year. This time it rang twice and connected to a recorded line. Not a voicemail, not a disconnected tone, but an automated government routing prompt that she hadn't expected. She hung up immediately. She sat with that for a moment. A government routing prompt meant the number was connected to a government line. A government line that connected to an automated system rather than a direct extension meant it was a relay. A number designed to route calls through a system that logged them without revealing the originating extension. Someone inside a government structure had called her using a relay number, which meant they didn't want the call traced back to them. Which meant they worked in an environment where calling her was a risk they were managing rather than a sanctioned action. She wrote down what she knew about the voice. Male, mid to late 40s, by register, slightly hoarse, the specific kind of hoarse that comes from a head cold rather than from speaking too much. The cadence of his sentences, short, front-loaded with information, the kind of verbal pattern that comes from operational context where you've learned to transmit the most important thing first in case you get cut off. He'd been watching Orwell's division for 3 months. That was what he'd said. Not I heard about Orwell or I have information about Orwell, but watching. Active, ongoing, specific. Which meant he was either running surveillance on Orwell as part of an authorized investigation into her operation, or he was doing it on his own, which carried its own implications about what he knew and what he was afraid of. He'd called her 4 times. The last call, the one where he'd been speaking quickly and then gone silent, she'd assumed the line dropped. But she went back to it now and played the recording through to the end, and at the very tail of it, right before the connection closed, there was a sound she'd processed as ambient noise the first time through. She played it again. A door. Specifically, a heavy door with a controlled close mechanism, the particular decelerated click of a door designed to shut quietly. An interior door, not exterior. The sound of an interior space, probably institutional, probably, given the ambient acoustic profile of the recording, a corridor rather than an office. He hadn't gone quiet because the line dropped. He'd gone quiet because someone had entered the corridor. She closed her laptop. The clock on her phone read 7:28. 1 hour and 32 minutes. She changed into the clothes she wore when she needed to be taken seriously. Not scrubs, not casual, the kind of clean, structured outfit that reads as someone who arrived prepared and knows it. She checked the bruise at her wrist, which had darkened fully overnight into a band of violet brown that was unambiguous to any set of eyes. She left it uncovered. She was out the door at 7:41. NAS's contact was a woman named Aldridge, who arrived at Harwick Medical's main entrance at 8:24 with a leather briefcase and the unhurried expression of someone who has spent 20 years being the calmest person in bad rooms. She was in her early 60s, wore her gray hair back, and introduced herself to Vera with a handshake that was dry and firm and entirely lacking in performance. "I've been briefed on the broad structure," Aldridge said. They were in a small conference room adjacent to the lobby, 35 minutes before the review meeting. "Walk me through your version." "My version is the only version," Vera said. "Everything else is framing." Aldridge looked at her steadily. "Then tell me the version and the framing you're expecting." Vera told her. All of it. The garage, the intervention, NAST, Orwell, the statement, the voicemail, the review request timestamp. Aldridge listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad in handwriting that was small and precise and entirely illegible from across the table. When Vera finished, Aldridge set her pen down. "The review request filed at 1:47 this morning. Do you know who filed it?" "Not yet." "NAST is working on that?" "Yes." "Good." Aldridge tapped the legal pad once. "The statement you gave Orwell, you signed it." "I did." "Is everything in it accurate?" "Yes." "Then we don't contest the statement. We contest the frame." Aldridge looked at her directly. "Here's what's going to happen in that room. Someone is going to present your involvement in the Level 2 case as unsanctioned federal interference by a civilian medical employee. They're going to use your military background to imply that your involvement was operationally motivated rather than clinically. They're going to suggest that the emergency escalation that brought you into the restricted wing was either engineered or exploited. And they're going to do all of this very calmly and with documentation that looks official. And we respond with, Vera said, Price's emergency escalation authorization, time-stamped and filed as of last night. your Harwick employment credential, and its explicit inclusion under the blanket emergency protocol for restricted wings. The body cam footage from the garage, which establishes that you were unlawfully detained by a Calverton PD officer for 47 minutes and physically assaulted, which is why you were in the garage instead of in the building, which means the timeline of your involvement in the Level 2 case begins not at your arrival in the wing, but at the moment Mercer put his hands on you. Vera looked at her. You were supposed to be in that room earlier, Aldridge said. The federal personnel on site, the nature of the case, your specific clinical background. You had been informally coordinated as available medical support. Mercer's intervention in the garage didn't prevent you from causing a problem. It caused the problem it was designed to prevent. The room was quiet for a moment. Someone knew I was supposed to be there, Vera said. Someone knew, and someone decided that keeping you out of that room was worth deploying a police officer off his assigned district to intercept you in a low camera zone. Aldridge picked up her pen again. Which means Mercer wasn't acting on his own initiative. Which means the question in that 9 o'clock meeting is not what you did wrong. It's what Mercer was told and by whom. The review meeting was held in the 4th floor conference room, a room that Vera had been in exactly twice before, both times for routine administrative reviews that had lasted 20 minutes and produced no particular consequence. It was a standard institutional space, long table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted screen for presentations, windows that looked out over the hospital's main entrance. The kind of room that looks like nothing and has hosted more consequential conversations than it appears capable of containing. She arrived at 8:56, 4 minutes before the scheduled start. Aldridge was beside her. Price had arrived 2 minutes earlier and was standing at the far end of the table with a folder in his hand and the expression of a man who has decided to be calm and is working at it. The hospital's administrative side was represented by the department head, a man named Garfield Owens, who ran the administrative division with the particular institutional caution of someone whose primary professional goal is to ensure that Harwick Medical does not appear in any headline for any reason. He looked at Vera when she came in, then at Aldridge, then back at his own folder, and said nothing. The Calverton PD side arrived at exactly 9. Sergeant Lou Ferrante came through the door with 2 people, a department legal representative named Wall and a civilian consultant Vera didn't recognize, a thin-faced man in his late 40s who sat down without introducing himself and placed a closed tablet on the table in front of him. Mercer was not present. This was notable. The federal liaison seat, the chair that had been set at the head of the table, was empty at 9 o'clock. At 9:02, it was filled by a woman who was not Sandra Orville, which was the first indication that the morning had developed differently than the people who had built this meeting intended. The woman who sat down at the head of the table was in her late 40s, darker complexion, with the specific kind of institutional composure that comes not from practice but from genuine indifference to other people's agendas. She set a black government credential wallet on the table, opened it, and placed it facing outward so the room could read it. Deputy Director, Federal Oversight and Compliance. Her name was Reyes. Ferrante looked at the credential, then at the thin-faced consultant. Something passed between them. Not words, just a micro-adjustment of body language that people make when a situation has departed from their prepared script. Reyes looked around the table with a calm, inclusive gaze that stopped briefly on Vera's wrist. The bruise, the uncovered bruise, and then on Aldridge, and then came to rest on Ferrante with an expression of polite expectation. I understand this review was requested at 1:47 this morning, Reyes said. Her voice was level and carried without effort. I'd like to begin by clarifying the filing. Owens leaned forward. The request was submitted through the hospital's federal liaison channel. It was submitted through a channel that has been suspended pending review since 6 o'clock this morning, Reyes said pleasantly. The person who filed the request submitted it using credentials that were revoked 4 years ago. We became aware of the filing at approximately 5:30 a.m., which is why I'm here rather than the liaison officer you were expecting. The room shifted. Ferrante went very still. Wall, the police legal representative, cleared his throat. I'm not sure what that means for the scope of today's. It means, Reyes said, that today's meeting is going to cover somewhat different ground than intended. She opened the folder in front of her. We'll begin with the incident in the parking garage, if that's acceptable. specifically with the question of why Officer Dale Mercer was operating in a district 6 miles outside his assigned patrol area last night. Ferrante's jaw moved. Officer Mercer responded to he logged off his assigned district radio at 11:08 p.m., Reyes said. He didn't log back on until 12:43, by which point he had already been on the premises of Harwick Medical for over an hour. His radio went silent for 94 minutes. She looked at Ferrante. Your department's dispatch logs show no call or assignment that would account for his presence here. So I'd like to understand. Who told Officer Mercer to come to this hospital last night? Ferrante said nothing. Sergeant, I'm not going to answer questions without... You're not under arrest, Reyes said with the same pleasantness. You're in an administrative review where the expectation is cooperation. If you'd prefer a different context for this conversation, that can be arranged, but it will be considerably less comfortable than this table. The thin-faced consultant reached forward and touched Ferrante's arm. Ferrante shook it off. I don't know why he was here, Ferrante said. Officers use discretion in... He received a call, Reyes said. At 10:51 p.m., 40 minutes before he went dark. The call came from a relay number registered to a federal coordination office. Specifically, the coordination function under the Deputy Director's Office, where a former federal employee named Sandra Orville has been operating on an unauthorized basis for the last 14 months. She paused. We've been building that case for 3 months. Last night accelerated our timeline significantly. Vera sat very still. Beside her, she could feel Aldridge doing the same thing. The conscious, professional stillness of a person who understands that the room has taken a turn that requires witnessing rather than intervention. Owens looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last 10 minutes. Are you saying that Officer Mercer was directed by a federal? I'm saying the call came from that number. What Mercer was told, and what he chose to do with that information, is a matter for the law enforcement review that is currently underway separately. Reyes looked at her folder again. What I'm establishing here is that the incident in the garage last night was not a routine patrol encounter. It was a targeted intervention designed to prevent a specific individual, she glanced at Vera, from being present in this hospital during a time-sensitive federal medical case. The room was quiet enough that the ventilation system was audible. Ferrante was the one who broke it, and the way he broke it was instructive. He didn't mount a defense. He didn't ask questions. He turned to Wall and said, very quietly, I need to speak with you privately before this continues. Wall looked at Reyes. Would it be possible to... No, Reyes said. We're not taking breaks. She turned the folder toward the center of the table. On the top page, visible to anyone who leaned forward, was a printed log, timestamps, call records, a column of case file numbers. We're going to cover the complaint suppression record first. 7 complaints over 6 years, 6 internal dismissals. 1 related to an identical pattern of behavior at this same facility. We'll then cover the coordination between Sergeant Ferrante's division and 2 members of the Internal Affairs Office. After that, we'll look at Orville's activity over the last 14 months and her contact with individuals in both city government and this hospital's administrative structure. She looked at Owens when she said that last part. Owens looked back at her, and something in his face went from institutional composure to something flatter and less managed. Mr. Owens, Reyes said, when did you first become aware that the security camera maintenance request for the North Garage had been pending since March? Owens opened his mouth, closed it. The maintenance logs show 3 escalated requests, all routed through the facilities department and all held at the same approval threshold without forward movement. Reyes was not raising her voice. She didn't need to. The person sitting at that threshold for all 3 requests is a facilities coordinator named Bart Holt, who has been employed at Harwick Medical for 7 years. Mr. Holt received a payment of $4,200 11 months ago in 3 installments from a shell account that traces back through 2 intermediaries to the same coordination office where Orville has been operating. The silence in the room was now a different quality entirely. The silence of people understanding that what they are sitting inside is not what they thought it was when they walked in. Vera looked at Ferrante. He had his eyes on the table. His hands were flat on the surface in front of him, and she could see from across the room that they were not entirely steady. "What you have in front of you," Vera said. Reyes looked at her. "The folder. You have more." It wasn't a challenge. It was a simple observation, and Reyes received it as such, with a slight inclination of her head that was neither confirmation nor denial, but somehow was both. Aldridge put her hand very lightly on Vera's forearm. Not a restraining touch, an acknowledging one. "I see it too." Price had been sitting at the far end of the table without speaking since the meeting began, and Vera had been aware of him peripherally. His posture, the way he'd been tracking the room, the particular quality of his silence. He was not a man who was comfortable being quiet in tense situations. His silence meant he was managing something. She looked at him directly. He looked back. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing the 2-second calculation she recognized from the intervention, the thing that happened in Price when he was weighing whether to say something that couldn't be unsaid. He opened his folder. "I need to add something to the record," he said. Reyes turned toward him. "At 2:15 this morning, I received a call from a woman identifying herself as a federal accountability representative." He kept his voice even, but it took visible effort. "She asked me detailed questions about Vera's clinical role in the Level 2 intervention. I answered them because I believed the call was legitimate. At the end of the call, she asked me to confirm, for the record, that Vera had made recommendations during the intervention that I had initially resisted." He put one page from his folder face up on the table. "This is my clinical log from last night, time-stamped, detailing every decision point in the intervention, including the points where I pushed back on Vera's recommendations and the points where the monitor data proved her right. I'm putting this on record because I believe someone intended to use my verbal confirmation of those disagreements to suggest that Vera's involvement was disruptive rather than critical." He looked at Reyes. "It was critical. Specifically and documentably critical. I want that unambiguous." Vera looked at him. He didn't look back at her. He was looking at Reyes, delivering the information in the flat, factual register of a physician documenting for the chart, not performing for the room. But she understood what it had cost him. The call with Orville, the questions he'd answered in the small hours of the morning, the dawning realization that his words had been harvested for a use he hadn't consented to. He hadn't come into this room to protect her. He'd come in to correct the record. Those are different motivations, and the distinction made it more real, not less. Reyes took his page, looked at it, and placed it in her folder. "Thank you, Dr. Price," she said. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 11 minutes. By the end of it, several things had been formally established. The review request filed at 1:47 a.m. was voided on the basis of the compromised credentials used to file it. Mercer's body cam footage had been reviewed by Reyes's team and submitted to the city's Law Enforcement Oversight Office, which had already opened a formal investigation separate from any internal Calverton PD process. Ferrante had invoked his right to legal counsel and would not answer any further questions, a decision that Reyes acknowledged without comment, and that functioned in the context of everything that had been laid out before it as its own kind of answer. The thin-faced consultant who had arrived with Ferrante left the room at the 90-minute mark without speaking a word during the entire meeting. Vera watched him go and filed his face into the category of things she would follow up on later, because a man who attends a meeting in a professional capacity and never once speaks is either irrelevant or crucial, and irrelevant people don't show up to rooms like this one. Owen spent the last 40 minutes of the meeting in the particular silence of a man understanding that his institution is about to be examined more closely than he is comfortable with, and that his previous choices, the slow-walked maintenance requests, the complaint handling, the administrative cooperation with people he should have questioned, are about to be part of that examination. At the end, Reyes closed her folder and looked around the table. The medical response in the Level 2 case last night will be documented as a properly authorized emergency escalation under Harwick Medical's existing protocol, consistent with Dr. Price's filing. She looked at Vera. "Your role in last night's intervention will be formally noted in the federal case file as a critical clinical contribution. That notation is effective immediately." Vera nodded. Regarding the events in the parking garage, Reyes paused, and for the first time in 2 hours, something in her expression moved towards something that wasn't purely procedural. It was brief. "The physical evidence is unambiguous. The investigation is proceeding at the city level with federal oversight. You'll be contacted through appropriate channels as the process develops. I understand, Vera said. She waited until the room was mostly empty before she stood. Aldridge was beside her, already organizing her notes. Price had come down the length of the table and was standing a few feet away with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who has been through something and is still in the process of deciding how to name it. Thank you, Vera said to him, for the log. It's accurate, he said. That's all it is. That's enough. He nodded once, the way Price nodded when he'd made a decision and was done revisiting it. Then he turned and walked out. Aldridge looked at Vera. You're all right? I will be, Vera said. The conference room was empty now except for the two of them and the residue of the morning, the water glasses, the scattered papers, the physical evidence of a meeting that had gone significantly differently than anyone in this building had designed it to go. Vera looked out the window. 4 floors below, the hospital's main entrance was moving through its ordinary morning rhythm. Visitors arriving, staff crossing the lot, an ambulance pulling up to the bay on the south side with its lights running. The city operating at its ordinary volume, unaware that anything unusual had happened inside this building, inside this room, inside a parking garage the night before. Then she saw the patrol car. Not Mercer's, a different unit, but Calverton PD markings, parked across the street from the hospital entrance with its engine running. And beside it, talking to the officer through the window, was the thin-faced consultant who had left the meeting 40 minutes early. He was pointing at the hospital entrance. The officer in the car nodded. Then the consultant looked up, directly at the 4th floor window. He couldn't have known which window she was standing at. The building had 27 windows on the 4th floor, and she was standing well back from the glass. But the angle of his gaze landed close enough that something cold moved through her chest, and she understood without uncertainty that the meeting upstairs had not ended whatever had begun in the parking garage. It had only moved it outside. Her phone buzzed, a text from Nast. Stay in the building. Don't use the main entrance. There's a situation developing on the street level that we're monitoring. Don't come outside until I clear it. She looked at the text, then at the window. The patrol car was still there. The consultant had stopped pointing, had stepped back onto the sidewalk, and was looking at his phone now with the focused composure of someone executing a sequence rather than improvising one. She typed back. How long? Nast's response came in 12 seconds. Unknown. We're moving. The patient in 214. He regained consciousness at 8:47 this morning. He's asking to make a statement. Vera stared at the message. The patient was awake. Alive. Awake. And asking to talk, which meant the case that someone had tried to compromise last night was about to become a testimony, which meant every person who had worked to keep that room dark last night was now facing a timeline they couldn't slow down or redirect, because the man whose silence they had bought and structured and protected through a police officer in a parking garage was about to open his mouth. And the thing about testimony, the thing that made it different from documents and footage and signed statements, was that it put a face and a voice on what happened, and once a face and a voice existed in a room, the architecture of denial had to work considerably harder. Her phone buzzed again. Different number. Not Nast. The same relay number the man had called from at 4 in the morning. One text. They know he's awake. They're not done. There's a name you don't have yet. Room 214 isn't safe. Vera was already moving toward the door. She took the stairs. Not the elevator, not the main corridor. The service stairwell on the west side of the building. The one that smelled like industrial cleaner and had a fire door on every landing that closed with a sound like a judgment. She'd used it 100 times during night shifts when the elevator took too long, and she had somewhere to be faster than the building wanted her to get there. She knew it the way she knew the garage. By feel, by repetition, by the specific texture of spaces you've moved through when you were too tired to look at them. She texted Nast while she moved. 214 may be compromised. Unknown internal threat. Patient awake. I'm going up. His response came before she hit the second landing. I have 2 people on that floor. Don't go in the room alone. She didn't respond to that. She took the stairs 2 at a time, with her phone in her hand and her mind running the shape of what she knew. The thin-faced consultant, the patrol car on the street, the relay number, the text. A name you don't have yet. Room 214 isn't safe. The person who'd been calling her had been watching Orville for 3 months. That kind of surveillance, that duration, that level of detail about the relay numbers and the coordination office and the mechanism of the whole thing, that wasn't something you built in your spare time. That was someone who was either running a legitimate covert investigation into Orville's operation or someone who had been inside it and had decided at some point between then and now to stop being inside it. The second option was more dangerous and more useful, and she was betting on it by the time she hit the level 2 door. She pushed through. The restricted wing corridor was quieter than it had been at 2 in the morning. The acute crisis had passed, the additional staff had cycled off, and what remained was the lower register hum of a ward that was monitoring rather than intervening. 2 of Nast's people were visible immediately. A man at the far end of the corridor standing near the wing entrance with the specific posture of someone who is present in a professional capacity and is not a hospital employee, and a woman in civilian clothes near the nursing station who was looking at a tablet but not reading it. Neither of them was looking at the right thing. The door to 214B was closed. Vera walked toward it, and the woman near the nursing station stepped forward. "He's not cleared for visitors." "I'm not a visitor," Vera said. She kept moving. "Ma'am, I need you to—" "Call Nast," Vera said. "Right now. Tell him I'm at the door and I need 30 seconds to check the room." The woman hesitated. In the pause, Vera looked at the door. Looked at it specifically, the way you look when you're reading a room through a closed door by the information available from its edges. The light under it was steady. No movement shadows. No sound. Then she smelled it. It was faint. The particular sharp, sweet undertone of a sedative agent that had been deployed in a closed space. Something fast-acting and aerosolized. The kind that doesn't announce itself with color or sound. She'd been in rooms where it had been used before. The smell was wrong for a hospital corridor. It was wrong for this floor. "Get everyone back," she said. Her voice had changed completely. Not loud, not urgent in the way that produces panic, the flat operational register that produces movement. "Now, move everyone back from this door." The woman looked at her. "I'm not asking," Vera said. Something in her tone moved the woman backward. The male agent at the end of the corridor was already coming toward them. Vera backed up 2 steps, put her forearm over her nose and mouth, and looked at the door handle. Specifically, at the gap between the door and the frame on the hinge side, where air moves. The movement there was wrong, barely visible, just a slight perturbation in the dust near the floor seal, the kind produced by positive pressure inside a closed space. Someone had sealed it from the inside. "Get medical response up here," she said to the male agent, who had reached her. "Possible chemical agent in the room. Do not open that door without respiratory protection." She turned to the woman. "Is Nast on the line?" "He's coming up." "How far?" 2 minutes. She didn't have 2 minutes. If the patient had been conscious at 8:47 and someone had acted on that information quickly, and the text had come in at 9:43, which was 56 minutes of window, then whatever was in that room had been there for some portion of that window, and the dosing timeline on fast-acting sedative agents in a closed space ran between 30 and 90 minutes, depending on concentration and the subject's physiology. The subject in that room was a man in his 60s who had been through major vascular surgery 12 hours ago. His window was shorter than the standard range. She grabbed the agent by the arm. "Does your team have respiratory equipment in this building?" "Vehicle, downstairs." "Get it up here in 90 seconds or the timeline runs out." She released him. He was already on his radio before he turned the corner. The woman, Nast's second operative, was looking at Vera with an expression that had moved past procedure into something more direct. "You know what's in there?" "I know what it smells like," Vera said. "I don't know the specific agent or the concentration. I know the delivery mechanism was through the door seal, which means someone got access to this room and exited before locking it from the outside." She looked at the handle. "The door locks from the inside with a secondary throw bolt. Someone threw it from the outside using the maintenance override." "How do you know that?" "Because the throw bolt on this model requires a specific key that the facilities department carries." Vera paused. "And because someone in facilities at this hospital has been on a payroll that we established this morning. Bart Holt, the facilities coordinator, the $4,200 in 3 installments. He hadn't just slow-walked the camera maintenance requests. He'd had access to every room in this building, every door, every override mechanism for 7 years. The woman was already on her radio. Vera heard the stairwell door open behind her, Nast moving fast, with 2 additional people she didn't recognize behind him. "Status," he said. "Possible sedative agent deployed in the room through the door seal. Patient has been alone in there for an unknown window. We need respiratory access before anyone opens that door." She turned to him. "Bart Holt, your team needs to find him in this building right now." Nast looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he turned to the person on his left and said 3 words that she didn't catch, and that person disappeared back through the stairwell door at a pace that communicated urgency without performing it. The respiratory equipment arrived in 78 seconds, not from the vehicle, but from the emergency response cart on level 3 that Vera had seen restocked 2 weeks ago and had, in the abstract, professional way that experienced trauma nurses maintain ambient awareness of their environment, noted the location of. The agent who brought it was out of breath and had clearly run. They suited 2 people, Nast's operative and the male agent who'd gone for equipment first, who turned out to have the relevant training. Vera stood back and watched them work the door and felt the particular helplessness of knowing exactly what needed to happen and not being the one doing it, which is a different kind of difficult than most people understand. The door opened. The air that came through it was wrong in the way she'd expected, thin and sharp, carrying the unmistakable signature of something manufactured rather than natural. The 2 suited personnel went in. 40 seconds of silence. Then patient's breathing, pulse present. He's under. Sedated, not in distress, airway clear. The breath Vera released had been building in her chest for 4 minutes. "Get a medical team up here with the antidote protocol for aerosolized benzodiazepine," she called to the nursing station, because she'd identified the agent now that she could smell it properly through the door gap. And she knew the reversal, and she knew the dosing, and she was already calculating the variables based on the patient's size, his surgical status, his current medication load. Darby appeared at the end of the corridor. She didn't know who had called him, but she was glad he was there. He looked at the scene with the practiced assessment of a charge nurse, who has been doing this long enough that surprised is not a mode he operates in. "Flumazenil," she said to him, "carefully. He's post-op vascular. His pressure is going to be variable. Small incremental doses, watch the response." Darby nodded once and was already moving. Bart Holt was found in the building's basement service corridor at 10:17 a.m. He wasn't running. That was the thing that Nast told her later, with a flatness in his voice that suggested he was still processing what it meant. Holt wasn't running, wasn't hiding, wasn't doing anything that looked like a man who knew the operation had collapsed. He was sitting on a utility crate near the mechanical room, eating a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria, with the maintenance override keys on the bench beside him. He looked up when Nast's people found him and said, without being asked anything, "I figured someone was coming." Nast told her this, and she sat with it for a moment, because there is something specifically dispiriting about a person who does a terrible thing and feels so insulated from consequence that they wait for it on a crate with a sandwich. The confidence of someone who has watched people get away with things for long enough that they have stopped imagining an alternative. He was wrong, this time. But he had been right enough times before to have earned that confidence, and that was the part that stayed with her. Holt gave a full statement within 2 hours. Not because he was heroic or remorseful, he wasn't, particularly, but because the people who had hired him had structured the arrangement in the way that arrangements like this are always structured, which is to say they'd left him holding everything that could be traced and kept themselves behind enough layers that he understood, now that it was over, that loyalty ran in one direction. He named the thin-faced consultant. The consultant's name was Marcus Vey, and he had spent the last 9 years working as a private security coordinator for a network of interests that had a complicated relationship with the federal witness whose heart had nearly stopped in room 214-B the previous night. Vey was not in government. He had never been in government. He carried documentation suggesting otherwise, which was one of the things that Orville's operation had provided: cover credentials for private actors operating inside institutional spaces. Vey was arrested at the Calverton Transit Center at 11:45 a.m., 40 minutes after Holt's statement named him. He had a bag packed and a ticket for a 2-connection route that would have taken him well outside the jurisdiction by early afternoon. He did not look surprised when they stopped him. He looked tired. The particular tired of a man who has been managing a complex operation for a long time and has known, in the back of whatever part of him still runs honest calculations, that the probability of this outcome has been climbing for months. He didn't speak voluntarily. That was his right. But the silence had its own texture, and Reyes, who had been briefed by phone in real time as the morning developed, noted in her formal record that Vey's demeanor at the time of arrest was consistent with prior knowledge of the investigation's scope. Orville was taken into federal custody at a location outside Calverton at 2:30 p.m. Vera wasn't told the details of how or where, only that it had happened, and that the 3 months of work that the man with the relay number had been doing had contributed materially to the ability to move on her at that moment, rather than losing her to another layer of jurisdiction or another set of cover credentials. She never learned who the man was. She thought about that occasionally in the weeks afterward. The voice, the relay number, the specific courage of someone who makes 4 calls at 4 in the morning to warn a stranger because the alternative is staying quiet. And staying quiet has become something they can no longer do. She didn't know his name, and she probably never would, and she decided that was all right. Some things don't require completion to be real. The patient in 214-B, his name was never entered into any public record, and Vera didn't ask, was restabilized by noon. The flumazenil reversal had been careful and measured, Darby at his best, incremental and watchful in the way that the situation required. By 2 in the afternoon, the man was conscious again, oriented, and in the company of federal personnel who were there to take his statement. Price found Vera in the staff lounge on level 1 at 3:15. He came in, looked at the coffee she was making, and sat down without asking if she wanted company. She took that as an accurate read of the situation and made 2 cups. "He's going to make it," Price said. He wasn't talking about just the afternoon. "I know," she said. She set his cup in front of him and sat across the table. The lounge was empty. Through the window, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in Calverton in this season, going golden and slightly sideways, the kind of light that makes the city look better than it sometimes is. "I got a call this morning," Price said. He was turning his cup in his hands. "From the hospital's risk management office. They want to review my authorization documentation for last night." "Aldridge will help you with that," Vera said. "I know." He paused. "They're not going to find anything wrong with it." "I know." He looked at his cup. "I should have trusted you faster. During the intervention, the imaging call." He said it the way Price said difficult things, directly, without cushioning, but also without flagellation, which was one of the things she respected about him. "I know why I hesitated. I'm not sure I have a good reason." "You had a reason," she said. "It just wasn't the right one." He nodded. That was enough. They drank their coffee in the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to reconstruct it out loud. After a while, he said, "What happens now, for you?" She thought about it honestly. "I talk to Reyes's people for however long that takes. I give depositions when they're needed. I go back to work." "Just that?" "That's not a small amount," she said. He smiled, not the polished, composed expression he wore in clinical settings, but something more tired and more genuine. "No," he said. "It isn't." Chat. Mercer's termination was processed by Calverton PD's Command Division on a Thursday, 12 days after the night in the garage. It was not a quiet termination. The formal charges of unlawful detention and excessive force had been filed by the city's Law Enforcement Oversight Office 4 days earlier, and the documentation attached to those charges included not only the body cam footage and the garage cameras, but 3 additional statements from individuals who had encountered Mercer over the previous 4 years and had, for various reasons, never made it into a formal record. They made it into this one. Paulette Arroyo made a statement. Vera learned this not from any official notification, but from a brief text that came from a number she didn't recognize, which was becoming a pattern in her life that she had complicated feelings about. The text said only, "She came forward, wanted you to know. No name." She suspected it was from the same person who had emailed her 3 weeks later with a link to a public record showing that a small settlement had been reached on Arroyo's behalf. Ferrante resigned from Calverton PD 2 days before the formal investigation into his complaint suppression record was scheduled to produce findings. Resignation before findings. The institutional equivalent of knowing the verdict and leaving before it's read, which fools no one and changes nothing about the record, only about the ceremony. The investigation continued regardless. His resignation was not accepted as a conclusion. The two internal affairs officers connected to Ferrante's complaint burial were suspended pending review. One of them cooperated. The other one lawyered up, which was his right, and the investigation ran on the schedule that investigations run on, which is slower than anyone wants and more thorough than the people being investigated prefer. Garfield Owens at Harwick Medical submitted his resignation 6 weeks after the events of that night. His letter cited personal reasons. The hospital's board accepted it and appointed an interim director while a formal search was conducted. And as part of that process, they commissioned an independent security audit of the facility that had, as one of its first findings, identified 11 additional maintenance requests for security infrastructure that had been held at the same administrative threshold as the garage cameras. Bart Holt was terminated and faced criminal charges. He had, in his statement, expressed something that sounded like regret, but landed more like inconvenience. The regret of a person who wishes they hadn't been caught, rather than the regret of someone who understands what they participated in. Vera heard this secondhand from Aldridge and filed it in the category of things that are true and disappointing without being surprising. She had stopped being surprised by that category a long time ago. The recognition, when it came, was not the kind she had expected. She had expected, if she'd thought about it at all, something institutional. A formal notation, a letter in a file, the bureaucratic equivalent of a gold star that would mean something to the people who read personnel records and nothing to anyone else. That was the shape recognition usually took in the environment she'd moved through, and she had made her peace with it mostly. What happened instead was smaller and more specific. It started with Tron, the resident, the one with the steady hands and the shaking that she'd controlled for 47 minutes in that room. 3 weeks after the night in question, Vera was coming off a day shift and Tran was at the nursing station doing the end-of-day documentation that nobody enjoys. And she looked up when Vera passed and said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about what you did that night, with the imaging call." She said it carefully, like she'd rehearsed the sentence and was still not sure it was right. "I didn't understand why you pushed for it when Price hesitated. I was watching you and I couldn't tell if you were confident or just committed." "What's the difference?" Vera said. Tran thought about it. "Confidence comes from knowing. Commitment comes from deciding." Vera looked at her for a moment. "It was both," she said. "Usually is, in the moments that matter." Tran nodded slowly, turning that over. She was 28 years old and she had stayed in a room for 47 minutes, under conditions that would have sent other people out the door. And she was going to be a very good doctor, and she didn't fully know that yet, which was exactly right for where she was. Then there was Darby. Darby didn't say anything. He was not a man who used words when their absence communicated the same thing more efficiently. What he did was show up at Vera's workstation one afternoon with 2 cups of coffee, the decent kind from the machine on level 3, not the standard floor coffee that tasted like a memory of coffee rather than the thing itself, and set one in front of her and go back to his work without commentary. She drank it. That was Darby's version of a speech, and she understood it completely. The formal recognition came 6 weeks out in the form of a letter from the deputy director's office, Reyes's office, that was 2 paragraphs long and used the specific constrained language of official government correspondence that is designed to communicate significance without sensationalism. It acknowledged her clinical role in the Level 2 case, her conduct under duress in the parking garage, and her contribution to what the letter termed the integrity of a critical federal process. It was careful language. It said exactly what it meant and nothing else. She read it once, folded it, and put it in the drawer of her bedside table where she kept the things she wanted to be able to find without looking for them. On the same day the letter arrived, she got a call from Nast. "The patient is being transferred," he said. "He's stable enough to move to a facility better suited to his long-term case. He asked me to pass something to you." "What?" He said, and I'm quoting here because he was specific about it, "Tell her that the difference between alive and not was about 12 minutes. Tell her I know that." Vera was quiet for a moment. 12 minutes is actually conservative, she said, but I'll take it. He also said to tell you that he's going to say what he has to say, whatever it costs. She understood what that meant. The testimony. The thing that someone had tried to prevent by engineering a night that was supposed to remove her from a corridor before she could stop what was meant to happen in a room on level 2. The witness who was supposed to be silenced was instead alive and talking, and whatever domino that set in motion would move at its own pace through courts and proceedings and institutional processes that she would not be a part of and did not need to be a part of. She had done what she could do in the time she had to do it. That was enough. It was actually enough. Nast, she said. Yeah. The man who called me. The relay number. Are you ever going to tell me who he was? A pause that was long enough to be its own answer. Someday, maybe, he said. Not yet. Is he okay? He's managing, Nast said, and the way he said it told her the managing was effortful and probably ongoing, and she left it there because she understood that some things are in process, and pushing them doesn't make them resolve faster. Thank you, she said. You kept a man alive, Nast said. I'd say we're square. She almost said something further and then didn't, because the sentence she'd formed in her head was about the nature of debt and the way that some things don't actually balance on ledgers the way people want them to. And it was too much for a phone call and probably too much for any conversation, so she let it go and they said goodbye and she put her phone down. She went back to work the next day, and the day after that. She went back to the parking garage, not to the spot near Bay 4, but the garage generally, because avoiding it would have meant giving the space a power over her that it didn't deserve, and that she wasn't willing to assign to it. She walked through it on a Tuesday morning on her way in, and she noticed that the light above Bay 4 had been fixed. No more flickering, just steady, flat illumination, the same as every other bay. Someone had finally gotten to the maintenance request. She stood under it for a moment. Not long, not dramatically, just a moment, and looked at the concrete wall she had been shoved against, and the floor, and the camera that had been watching and recording the whole time. Then she kept walking. This is a thing that most people don't understand about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It isn't the absence of damage. It isn't imperviousness or performance or the refusal to feel the weight of what lands on you. It is the decision, made in real time, imperfectly, with full awareness of the cost, to not let what you've absorbed determine what you do next. Vera had been dismissed by a man who thought powerlessness was something visible in a person's posture. He had looked at a woman waiting for a car and seen nothing worth respecting, and he had acted on that assessment with the full confidence of someone who had acted on it before and faced nothing for it. What he hadn't seen was the 12 years of moving through hard places that had taught her how to be very still in the middle of violence. What he hadn't seen was the specific knowledge that lived in her hands, not just clinical, not just procedural, but the deeper knowledge of what it means to stay present when the situation is pulling you toward panic or anger or the desire to make yourself smaller so that less of you is available to be hit. What he hadn't seen was that the stillness was not passivity, it was calculation. It was, in its own way, the most powerful thing in the garage that night. He had made her the story he needed her to be. He had been wrong. And the wrongness hadn't needed her to fight it or perform it or narrate it. It had only needed her to hold on long enough for the truth to be in the same room as the people with the authority to act on it. That's the version of justice that doesn't look like justice from the outside. The slow, grinding, unsexy version where the evidence accumulates and the paperwork moves and the person in the wrong finds themselves, over the course of days and weeks, running out of places to put the accountability that has been building behind them like water behind a dam. It doesn't feel like a movie moment. It feels like Tuesday morning, the light above Bay 4 finally fixed, a woman with a bruise that has almost faded walking through a parking garage on her way to do work that matters. Vera walked into the hospital. Darby was at the nursing station. He looked up when she came through the door. He had a cup of coffee in each hand, already, before she'd even clocked in, which meant he'd been watching the entrance, which meant he'd known she was coming and had decided to do something about it. He held one out without making it a thing. She took it. "Any excitement overnight?" she said. "Quiet," he said. "How are you?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. The bruise at her wrist was faded to yellow at the edges. Her shoulder pulled slightly when she lifted her arm above her head, but was improving. The paperwork from the investigation was ongoing and would be ongoing for months. The man in 214 was alive and talking in a facility she didn't know the location of. Paulette Arroyo had said what she needed to say. A light in a parking garage had been fixed. Good, she said. It was true enough. It was, in fact, exactly true. Not the unearned fine she'd told the rideshare driver in the small hours of the morning after a night that had tried to take everything from her, but the specific present tense good of a person who knows what they've been through and is standing on the right side of it. Darby nodded like he believed her. She picked up the first chart of the morning and went to work.